Hello, I'm Helen Bradley. Welcome to this video tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can create something that is reminiscent of a tissue paper collage effect in Illustrator. Before we get started with this video tutorial, let's look and see what it is that we're trying to achieve. I'm going to show you how you can create a collage effect like this in Illustrator, and it's somewhat reminiscent of working with tissue paper and glue. So we're going to create all these elements, and I'm going to show you how you can texturize them and how you can make things transparent so that they layer on top of each other. And you're also going to see how you can create the background. So if you're ready, let's get started. To start this illustration, I've created a new file. I went to File and then New. I made an image that is the 1000 points by 1000 points in size, but it doesn't really matter how big yours is. And I've set the color mode to RGB, and I just clicked OK. Now I want to get some colors that I'm going to use, and I've been using cooler, so I went to the web to get some cooler color schemes that would be sort of grape colors, if you like. And so these top color schemes are all grapes, and that will help me when I'm coloring my pieces. But you could just as easily create your own colors as you work. We're going to start with the grapes, and they're going to be created using the ellipse tool. So I'm going to click on the ellipse tool, and I'm just going to draw my first grape, and it's just going to be a fairly large one. I want to get through this fairly quickly for you. I'm going to target the stroke color and turn that off, and then target the fill color, and I'm going to color this particular grape, and it's a dark purple. Now with tissue paper, when you work with it, you'll know that it has some transparency. So I'm bringing up the appearance panel here, and you can get to that by choosing Window and then Appearance. And we're going to alter the opacity of this shape so that we can see through it, and when it's stacked on top of other shapes, they're going to overlap, and we're going to see that. To do that, with this shape selected, I'm going to this opacity setting. It's not the one on the fill, it's not the one on the stroke, it's the very bottom one here. I'm just going to take the opacity down to about somewhere around 80. This is not rocket science at all. You'll be able to find a value that works for you, but I'm thinking somewhere between sort of 75 and 85 is going to be a good figure. So this is our first grape, but it looks perfect, and if we were going to cut this out of tissue paper, it wouldn't look anywhere near that perfect. Well, certainly not the way I cut tissue paper out. So let's go over here to the toolbar position that holds the width tool, and we're just going to open this flyout panel because this is the one we want. It's the Wrinkle tool. So I'm going to target it. But we need to set some settings for it before we start, because firstly, it's too small. It doesn't even cover my shape. And secondly, it's not both horizontally and vertically set. So we're going to double click on the Wrinkle tool here to open the Wrinkle tool options. And this is its size, the width and height, and I'm going to set these to 200 and 200 because I know that's going to work fairly well for this particular size shape that I'm working with. The other thing here is that the horizontal is set to 0%, and we want to set it to 100% to match the vertical, so that we're going to wrinkle effectively in all directions. And then we want to go to intensity, because 50% is going to wrinkle this up into worse things than tissue paper and glue. So I'm just going to set this to 10%, which is going to let us hit the key a couple of times if we need to add a bit more of a wrinkle. And I'll click OK. So this is now my wrinkle brush. So now I'm going to hit it on the top of this shape, and you can see that the shape got a whole lot more anchor points, and when I just click away from it, it's now got an uneven edge, an edge that is more reminiscent of having been cut out using scissors. Now I can use this shape to make some of my additional grapes, so I'm just going to hold the Alt key as I drag away a duplicate of this shape. And as I do so, I'm going to make sure that the fill color here is at the very front, and I'm just going to choose a different fill color for this shape. And let's place it on top of this one, and you can see already that this transparency is starting to make it look like these two shapes are actually placed on top of each other. Tissue paper has that transparency built in. We can also select this and rotate it so that it doesn't have its bumps in the exact same position, and we can also resize it a little bit because grapes are going to be different sizes. So I'm going to go and do that a few times. I'm going to just keep recoloring my grapes, changing the size or the shape of these, and occasionally I may also go and draw out a new shape. So instead this time making a proper circle, which I can do by holding the shift key as I drag. This time I'm not going to make a perfect circle because this grape's going to be slightly oblong in shape, but again I'm going to wrinkle it. Make sure that I hit it with the Wrinkle Tool, and because it's a new shape I'm going to have to change its opacity down. So this time I'm going to choose, well, let's choose 75-ish for this, and then we're going to place it into position, and I'm going to continue to do this until I've got my grapes. So I'm going to come back in a few minutes once I've done this. Now I've gone ahead and created my grape shapes. Now right now it's looking as if it's a pretty small sort of illustration, but we can solve that by selecting over all the shapes, and we could enlarge it on the artboard to make it a bit bigger, or later on we could just crop the artboard down to size. So you don't need to worry too much about how big it is as long as you're happy with the overall presentation. You'll see here that I've added some grapes on top of the other grape. So I've just, for example, copied one of these grapes by selecting on it and Alt dragging it, or Option dragging it, into position over the top of the others. Now I've done this because if we were making a tissue paper collage, we would be layering pieces over the top of other pieces. So I'm just moving this around until I'm happy with its position. The next thing we're going to do is to texture these shapes, and we're going to do that using a brush. So I'm going to go to the brushes panel and click here and choose Open Brush Library, and then choose Vector Packs, Grunge Brushes Vector Pack. I want to get hold of this. Now if you don't have your brushes panel visible, you would just choose Window Brushes to make it visible. Now the brush I'm interested in is this one here, because I'm going to borrow some pieces from it to make a brush that we can use. So I'm going to target this brush, click on the brush tool here, and just drag a small line to draw this brush shape. I'm going to zoom into this because we need to work in this area right now. I think that this could be a little bit wider, so I'm going to click on the line and I'm just going to increase the stroke, because when I do so the width is made a little bit wider. Now I want to get rid of this piece at this end because I don't want it, I do want this piece here. So I'm going to choose Object and then Expand Appearance, because this turns the element from being a line into a series of very small vector shapes. Now I can go and grab the lasso tool and just drag around the pieces that I don't want. So I'm going to make a sort of organic selection here, select on these pieces and press delete. And you can see that that's had the effect of deleting that piece at the end there. Now you'll see that when I select over this, I'm still getting a sort of outside edge here, and that's probably because there's a path here. So let's just go into the layers palette, again window layers, to see it and see what we've got here. Well, here is the group. Let's just open up the group, and you can see that there are a couple of paths here. There's this one which is left over down the bottom here, and there's this one which is this path around here, neither of which we want. So let's just get rid of those. So now when we select things, we're actually selecting the shapes here and not everything else. Well, nearly. We've still got a piece hanging around here. So let's just go and get rid of that as well. Now when we select here, yes, we're just selecting these shapes. So I'm going to grab hold of all of these vector shapes and I'm going to duplicate them. Edit, copy, and I'm going to put them down in exactly the same place. Edit, paste in place. So I've got two on top of each other, and now I'm just going to move that top copy around and resize it a little bit. And perhaps just place it over here. What I want to do here is to create something that is a sort of interesting brush, so that when I paint it over the grapes, it's going to add some texture to them. So let's call that good. If I'm happy with that, now I can select all of this and make a brush from it. So what we've done is we've pulled apart effectively one of these grunge brushes, and we've made our own custom brush out of it, taking the pieces that we want and leaving behind the bits that we didn't. So I'm going to just drag and drop this combined shape into the brushes palette. And I want this to be an art brush. So I'm going to click on Art Brush and just click OK. And now we can select how it paints. Well, we want to do tints and shades so that it will paint with the color that we want to use. And we're going to paint in probably this direction. So if I paint in this direction, it's going to be laid down like this. But it doesn't really matter too much which direction we choose for this particular brush. And I'm going to stretch to fit stroke length and just click OK. Now I can get rid of this shape because I don't need it any longer, so I'm just going to select it and delete it. And move my brushes panel out of the way. I can close down the grunge brushes vector pack. I don't need that any longer. And to get my image back, Control 0, Command 0 on the Mac. Now the technique that we're going to use to texture these shapes is a really interesting one. I'm going to first select this shape here and we're going to texture it. I'm going to target this icon here, which is the Draw Inside icon, and it gets this little sort of edge around it, which is telling me that anything I do now is going to happen inside this shape. It's going to create a clipping group. So let's go and get our paintbrush. Let's make sure that we've targeted the brush that we wanted, and let's just undo that because it didn't happen the way I wanted it to. And I'm going to just drag and paint over the shape, and we can see here that now we have a texture in our shape. Once I've done that, I'm going to click here to draw normal. I'm immediately going to go and select the next shape, click Draw Inside, pick up my paintbrush and paint a stroke. And I'm going to make sure that over time I change the stroke direction. So let's go back to Draw Normal. Let's go back to the selection tool, select this shape, select Draw Inside, pick up the brush, and you can see each time the brush is picking up the same color as the shape was. And I'm going to draw in a different direction, back to Draw Normal, back to the selection tool. It's fairly quick to do this, and what we're doing is we're texturizing these shapes as we do it. So I'm going to go ahead and finish all of these shapes doing this Draw Inside. Click on Draw Inside, click on the brush, add a brush stroke, go back to Draw Normal, and then select the next stroke. And I'll come back when I finish this step. Now I've gone ahead and textured these shapes. I can make sure that I've textured all of them by opening up the Layers panel and making sure that I'm seeing clipping groups all the way here. If I see something like this, which is just a path, that's telling me that this one has not been textured. So I can select it here by just clicking on this icon. It's not easy to see that it hasn't been textured, but we know that it hasn't been textured because it hasn't changed into a clipping group. So I'm just going to finish this one up, and then it is turned into a clipping group so that we know that we've finished that step. Now, if you've ever worked with tissue paper before, you'll know that when you work with tissue paper, it's really hard to get flat. In fact, it buckles as you work. So you may want to add some extra elements to this collage by zooming in here, and I'm going to choose the pen tool, and I'm just going to create a very small triangle. So I'm going to click and drag and just create this triangle in here. Now I can go to the direct selection tool if I need to alter this and make it a little bit more curved, so it just sort of curves around the edge of this piece of tissue paper. Now I'm going to switch the stroke and fill colors because I want this to be a fill that we're looking at, and I'm going to sample this fill color as the fill color I'm going to use so that the tissue paper is bent and it's going to behave as if it was this exact same piece of tissue paper here. But you can see that this has come in as fully opaque, so what I need to do is to go to the Appearance panel and change the opacity of this as well. And I may not want it to be very high. So, well, 73 looks pretty good here. So we're actually going to see this triangle as being a slightly darker area over the rest of this shape, as it would be if our tissue paper was actually bent as we worked. And I would go around and do this in a few places around my shape. So again, grabbing the pen tool, I'm just going to click here, click and drag here to make a slightly more curved area, click and click. And again, I can go and make this a little bit more accurate. It really depends what you want to do with this illustration. If it's going to be printed at a fairly small size or shown on the web, you may not need it to be as accurate as it would be if you're going to blow this up quite sizable. Now, I want to darken this, so I'm actually going to change this blend mode to multiply, because that's going to give me a darkening effect. But I also want it to be still some transparency in it. So I'm going to bring this transparency down to about, let's see, maybe about 50% on this shape, and then just click away from the shape. I might go back to this other triangle that I did and alter it a little bit. Let's select it here. It's a little bit difficult to see, and I think the reason why it's difficult to see is the blend mode is wrong. I'm going to set that to multiply, and that's much better. And so I would do that in a few places. Now the other thing is that tissue paper is not always going to buckle from the edge inwards. It may actually buckle in the middle. So let's go and get this piece, and let's just create a very simple shape here. I'm going to target the direct selection tool here and just reshape this a little bit. If I hold the Alt key or Option key, I can drag these handles separately to each other. Now again, I want to color this the exact same color as the piece it's over the top of. I want to change its blend mode to multiply so it darkens, and then just adjust down the opacity a little bit. And again, I'm just going to click outside here and Control or Command 0 to go back. And I would go and add a few more of those to my illustration. And then we're ready to go ahead and create the grape leaves. I've gone ahead and added some more of those elements to my illustration. In some cases, I just copied the existing ones and just adapted them, rotated them, and put them in place. Now it's time to create the grape leaves, and I really think for this you're probably going to need to use the pen tool. So I'm going to click on the pen tool, and I'm just going to create a rough leaf shape. So I'm just going to do this by clicking and dragging when I want to go to a slightly curved shape. Now obviously the color of this is not good at all, but I'm just looking to build up a rough leaf shape at this point. I'm going to finish by just clicking back over the starting point. And now I'm going to color this by selecting a color from my Cooler palette here, or you can select it from whatever palette you're using. And I'm going to change down the opacity of it again, so it's going to look like it's made from tissue paper. And now we can come back in by selecting the direct selection tool and click on any of these points and just rework our leaf. But again, remember that this is not a leaf so much in real life. It's really just something that you have created by cutting it out with scissors. So you're not going to want to be too accurate here. I'm just grabbing the anchor point tool because I want some handles for this particular shape. And so you want to make sure that it really does look as if it could have been created by just cutting it out with scissors. So I'm going to work a little bit at making something of a leaf shape here. And when I'm done, I'm going to just move it into position. Well, I'm going to call this good for now. So I'm going to put it in position and rotate it here. And then I'm going to go and create a second one, and then I'm going to texture them using the exact same texture brush. So again, I'm going to select my shape, I'm going to target the draw inside option, I'm going to go and get my brush, I'm going to make sure I'm using this particular art brush, and I'm going to drag to texture it. And this time I'm going to add a few textures because I want to make sure that it's textured pretty much all around the leaf shape, and I'm going to add some of those little triangle darken areas as well, and we'll come back when we've done that. I've gone ahead and created the leaves for this plant, and I've added the little accents. I want to start moving these around a little bit, but if I start moving them, I'm going to leave various pieces behind, so I don't really want to do that. What I'm going to do is go and get the selection tool and select over the pieces that I want to keep together. So once I've got these pieces all selected, I'm going to choose Object and then Group. And now as they're grouped, they're going to move together as a group, and they're also going to size as a group so that I can do all sorts of things with them. But the pieces that I've put together so carefully are not going to be broken out of there. I'm going to do the same for this one. There's a few pieces in here that I want to grab. Well, I want to keep these pieces here, and I know there's a little piece in there, so I'm going to make a group out of these as well. And again, that's going to give me flexibility to move this around and reshape it without losing all the effects. The next thing is to add the stalk, and I'm going to do that in two pieces. I'm just going to do it using the pen tool, but it's not going to be difficult at all. I'm going to get a sort of brown color to use, and I'm just going to make a sort of rectangle, but I'm not going to be very careful about making it a perfect rectangle. And I'm going to go and make a second one. And with these, exactly the same as I did with all the other pieces, we're going to decrease the opacity of these so that we can see through them a little bit. And we're going to also brush our texture into them. We could even change the color a little bit. For this one, I'm just going to double click on this color, and I'm going to make it a little bit darker. So it's still in the same basic tonal range, but it's a little bit different to the previous one. Again, let's just brush in our texture. Let's go and get this one, select it, draw inside, grab our brush, take the brush from a different direction this time. Make sure we go back to drawing normally, and go and position our pieces in place. And again, overlapping them so that we get this sort of tissue paper element. Now these are not thick enough, I don't think, so I'm just going to widen them. Again, because we're going for this sort of collagey look, the fact that we're stretching these things and moving them into position doesn't really make a big difference. In fact, it's just adding to the effect. Now, I think I'd like to place my stalks on a lower level, so I'm going to move them behind the tissue paper leaves. So I'm just going to target these two stalks here in this layer, and I'm just going to drag them down so they appear below the leaves. So they're going to be partially transparent because the leaves are partially transparent. So you're going to see them a little bit through the underlying tissue paper effect. To finish off, I may want to add a slight drop shadow to these elements, just the very, very smallest of drop shadows. So I'm going to take my selection tool and select over this leaf, and to add a drop shadow effect, stylize, drop shadow. And I want the color to be probably something like the color that we're using here. So I'm just going for a greenish sort of color. I want to preview it so I can see the effect, but I don't want a very big blur at all. In fact, I've sized this well down from the standard, and what I've done is a 2-point X offset, a 2-point Y offset, and a 2-point blur. That's a lot lower than the traditional blur value that you get in the drop shadow box here, and we've set it to multiply. Once I've set that drop shadow up, if I select this object and choose Effect, Stylize Drop Shadow, it's going to get exactly the same drop shadow on it. So I'm just going to click OK. And we could add drop shadows to each of these other objects if we wanted to, or you may actually reduce this drop shadow. I'm thinking that 2 points is probably a bit much for this one, so I'm going to select it, and in the Appearance panel just double click on drop shadow here, and here I can reduce it even more. I'm going to make it even a tinier blur, which I think is going to be better. To finish off this piece, I would add a background to my illustration. So I'm going to go and add a rectangle that is the size of the artboard. So I'm going to click on the rectangle tool here and just drag out a rectangle the size of the artboard. Now it's going on the top of this layer here. I'm going to put it on a layer all by itself. So I'm going to click Create a New Layer. I'm going to move this path onto this new layer here. And now I'm going to close down layer 1 and just move layer 2 below it so I can make sure that my background will be behind my entire illustration. I can fill my background with all sorts of things, but one thing I like to do is to use a texture. And to do this, I'm going to the Swatches panel here. I'm going to open up the flyout menu, open Swatch Library, go down to Patterns, and go into Nature and go into Nature Foliage. These are texture patterns that come with Illustrator. And I'm just going to select one of these. Well, I want to turn off the stroke around this shape. I'm going to make sure I have fill selected. I'm just going to target these and just see if there's something that is going to work for me. Now these are obviously way too much in the way of texture. We would never use anything as intense as this, but we might find something that we could use that is a little bit interesting. And I kind of like this texture. It's kind of a good one to use, but of course it's way too dark. Well, we can go to the appearance for this path and we can change the opacity of this texture. So I'm just going to make it almost non-existent. So just very pale in the background. And I'm going to set its blend mode to multiply, because what I'm going to do, because I'm going to add another fill to this particular path. So I'm going to go down here and click on Add New Fill. Now it comes in with the same fill as it had previously. We don't want that. So I'm just going to click here and let's choose a color. So I'm going to choose a color like this. And I want to make sure now that it's going to blend in with the rest of the illustration. So let's go to opacity and let's take its opacity down a little bit. And now we've got our second fill in place, but in actual fact these two fills are the wrong way round. I need to drag this fill below this one. And the reason for this is that the multiply blend mode works from the top down. So you have to have it on the top element so that it will then blend in with the element below. So our pattern is now showing through the color underneath. And we could adjust this fill opacity down a little bit. I'm just going to grab its opacity and take it down so it's not quite so intense. And so we've got sort of something much lighter and looking a little bit more like a textured paper rather than a solid color. Now be aware that when you're adjusting the opacity here, this time we're adjusting the opacity of the fills rather than the opacity of the overall shape, because we want these fills to interact with each other, and so each of them needs its own opacity setting. So there you have our final result. We have created a faux tissue paper collage effect in Illustrator, and we've done it by cutting out pieces as if we had cut them out of tissue paper with scissors, and we used the Wrinkle Tool to wrinkle the edges. We've filled them with various purpley sort of colors, and then we've painted inside them with a brush that we created ourselves to add texture to them. And we've gone ahead and done the same thing for the grapes as we did for the leaves and the stalks, and we've just assembled the piece together. I'm Helen Bradley. Thank you for joining me for this video tutorial. Look out for more of my video tutorials here on this channel, and consider subscribing to my channel and you'll be alerted when new videos are released. And visit my website at projectwoman.com, where you'll find more tips, tricks and tutorials on a range of applications including Photoshop, Lightroom, Illustrator and a whole lot more.